Now we get to, as it were, the main event when it comes to my claim about the most overlooked um, sort of threat, business ethics issue and threat. Um, and that it has to do with everything that we've been working up to so far. The issue of um, there's a kind of common sense understanding about truth and facts, which you've all worked really well with on the essays and the ESPN writings, the reflection on the implications of the low PIAAC capabilities. And so the point of that is to sort of set the stage to the fact that how it is that we have what I'm calling a misinformation industry. Actually, it's worse than misinformation. It's misinformation, conspiracy, fear, and conflict and the like. But so what I want to do is now sort of explain all of, what I mean when I say that. But also I want to, we're going to get into some, so this is our first foray also into ethical theory. And to show that when I say this and I say, this is a big deal, this is a significant issue, there's a way in which I'm going to sort of introduce you to a little bit of something from the philosopher John Rawls, which in many ways, Rawls gives us he does this book, A Theory of Justice, but it's a very common sense way to talk about fairness and justice. But that'll be clear in a moment. So let's do this. Okay. Slideshow. Here we go. As I've been saying, what I consider the most overlooked business ethics issue is the monetization of ignorance, fear, and conflict in, the information industry. And I say that's a misnomer now. As I said, I'm going to, excuse me, do a little something with talking about philosopher John Rawls, very basic, really common sense theory about justice, which speaks to the issue of the moral or social responsibility of business, and then get into what I see as this particular issue. Okay, so Rawls has as his background, he comes from the social contract tradition. That is the idea that if you're talking about how a society should be run, the idea is that it should be terms that people agree to, and that, so we don't have divine right of kings, we don't have authority from top down. It's that you put a society together and you make the rules according to what people agree to. And, democracy is a big example of that. So the principles that we're talking about, the principles that free and rational persons concerned to further their own interests would accept in an initial position of equality as defining the fundamental terms of their association. What Rawls is saying is that, look, if you want to decide what is a fair agreement about how we operate, how we deal with one another, you need to have a situation where people are, you want an objective and you want a fair outcome, but you want people to be able to make a decision that is free and that advances their own interests, that it's their choice. The problem is when he says, the interest would accept in an initial position of equality as defining the fundamental terms of their association. I'm not going to get into some of the theory about that, but Rawls says, look, the problem is if we sit down and do that now, we all have a vested interest in keeping things that we want, that advance our interest, and making sure that the others don't take our advantages away. So we aren't really, if we were to sort of do that now, draw up a social contract, an agreement about how we operate in our communities, we all have conflicts of interest. So question, how do you get around that? The way you get around that is what Rawls calls the original position or veil of ignorance. So we imagine a situation like this. The original position of equality corresponds to the state of nature in the traditional theory of the social contract. No one knows his place in society, his class position or social status, nor does anyone know his fortune in the distribution of natural assets and abilities, his intelligence, strength, and the like. The principles of justice are chosen behind a veil of ignorance and are the result of a fair agreement. Fancy way of saying, imagine a situation where we know that the way life is going to operate is that it's going to be different. Some of it we're going to have advantages in some ways, we're going to have disadvantages. Some people will be rich, some people will be poor. Some people will have diseases and some people will not. Some people will have accidents and not. Some people will have talents in different ways. We need to make sure that if we're going to decide what the rules are about how everything operates on this side, that we come up with our agreement blind to what what the deal is going to be. If we are on, if we know we're going to end up with massive amounts of wealth or great talents, we're going to be tempted to say, yeah, I want to make sure that I'm able to have as much wealth as possible and take advantage of my talents as much as possible. On the other hand, if you know you're going to be poor and sick and disabled, you're going to want to skew the agreement in that way. Any differences you want to make sure are going to help you. So Rawls says, look, we what he calls the veil of ignorance. We do this on this side, not knowing where we're going to end up. Now that means you have to do best case, worst case calculation. You want to protect yourself. Certainly, you want to protect yourself as far as worst case scenario goes. But you also want to make sure that if you are able to get some benefit, that you're able to keep at least some of that. So that's the theory behind this. And what Rawls says is this. He says the persons in the initial situation would chose two different principles. The first requires equality in the assignment of basic rights and duties, while the second holds that social and economic inequalities, for example, inequalities of wealth and authority, are just only if they result in compensating benefits for everyone, and in particular for the least advantaged members of society. So Rawls says, on this side of the veil of ignorance, it's rational and it is self-interested to insist that there are two basic rules that are going to apply over here. Everybody's rights and duties are the same. Fundamental principle of equality. No matter what, everybody has the same rights, everybody has the same duties. And secondly, social and economic inequalities are just only if they result in compensating benefits for everyone, and in particular the least advantaged. Okay, so you can have wealth, you can have differences in power, but that's justified only if it benefits everyone, and especially if the people who are least advantaged get taken care of. Now, for Rawls, this is just a common sense definition of justice and fairness. So we say, okay, as this relates to business, Rawls is referring to what he calls the original position and the veil of ignorance. So we can imagine then, if we think, okay, if we're going to do this, if we're going to set down the terms, at least in theory, at least in principle, about how business should operate, what are we going to do? Well, we're going to think of it as a contract. So we're going to say, what are the terms of the agreement that determine how business should operate? In particular, from our perspective, what are the terms about what we're going to call the moral and social responsibility of business? We know that the possibility is there for business to be used in an antisocial fashion. So we're going to say, okay, what are the terms that every rational, self-interested person would agree to before you actually roll everything out? How should businesses operate? That is, if we're on this side, and we know that there's going to be business and there's going to be ups and downs, what do we say as the rules about how this is going to function? What would we agree to? What would we freely agree to, knowing we may benefit, we may not, from what goes on the side of the wall. Okay, at a minimum, we'd say business must not be conducted in a way that undermines basic human rights, the conditions for flourishing, and we're going to get into that next week, and must not profit from, foster, or enable unacceptable behavior. Remember, we're drawing up what are the rules, what are the terms of the contract for how business should operate, and you know, what a rational, self-interested person agree to. Okay, first, like business shouldn't undermine human rights. Secondly, the unacceptable behavior includes, at a minimum, actions that lead to physical or emotional harm, hatred, prejudice, and the like, lying, manipulation, promoting racial or civic strife, social conflict, etc. If you're in the original position, as it were, behind the veil of ignorance, and you're going to say, okay, let's set out what are going to be the just and fair rules about how business should operate. And you need to protect yourself. Remember, you're doing risk analysis, and you're doing worst case scenario protection. And so you want to be sure that you cannot be, if everyone goes by the rules that the terms they've accepted, you can't be the target of harm. That is, you can't be in a situation where money is going to be made from you being hurt, you being the victim of hatred, you being the victim of prejudice, and the like. The transgressions, we're talking about ethics. We aren't talking about law, but we are talking about what we can talk about as the violation of the moral responsibility of a particular company. And as Sarah is saying, well, but aren't there times when this doesn't really apply? No, we're gonna go with the idea the ends do not justify the means. And seriously, think about it this way. You're trying to set out the rules that make sure you're able to be protected from someone else taking advantage of you. You can maybe able to imagine that if you are able to get away with the idea that the ends justify the means to make a profit, you don't know which side of that transaction you're going to be on. So the logical self-interested thing is you say, well, look, no, the ends don't justify the means. I do not agree. It is not rational for me to agree to be in a situation where business is conducted in a way that my rights, my welfare, my well-being is potentially harmed so someone else can make some money. What I'm claiming then is that the violation of these terms, that is, we're thinking of a contract, terms of an agreement, the violation of these terms is so common as to have normalized the pursuit of profit through clearly unacceptable and antisocial behaviors. I am also claiming that this is a matter of a deliberate and/or tacitly accepted business plan. Companies are profiting directly and indirectly from this. Now, in support of this strategy, this new business model, freedom of expression has in practice been redefined as freedom from responsibility for the consequences of one's actions. This is a really critical point, because what I'm going to contend is that there is really significant amounts of harm done under the guise of freedom of expression, because what happens is that's a great defense for being able to make boatloads of money off of ignorance and fear and all of the other things that no rational person would agree to. And that there are unintended but foreseeable negative consequences of these business strategies. So that's that's kind of the claims that I'm making, which is that if we were to sit down and draw up rules of the game, as it were, for how business should operate, and not knowing how it's going to work out on the other side of the veil of ignorance, we would all say pretty much the same thing. Business is fine if it's open and honest. Business is fine if I'm protected from being victimized in all of this, and human rights need to be protected. That's just basic welfare of people. Who's going to agree to compromise their rights on that scale? And that, yes, we are talking about an ends justify the means situation. Not surprisingly, what I'm arguing is that when I say this has now become a norm, talking about primarily Fox News, Facebook, Twitter, X, and now there, as I've also hinted at in some of my other videos, this is something that is done pretty much across the spectrum. In this video, I'm just going to talk about these companies. I'll hint a little bit at the others, but these are the main players in this. Now, more specifically, I am claiming that the January 6th insurrection, the preventable COVID deaths, and a variety of natural disasters have been brought to you by American business. These were all things that happened. That is, bad stuff connected with all these happened because it was profitable, and there was no way that this got dialed back. For example, in the January 6th insurrection, there are now about 10 people have died, 140 officers injured, more than 1,000 people have been charged, prison sentences, and all of this happened because of misinformation. There were more than 1 million deaths from COVID, of which about a third were preventable, and a variety of natural disasters. Climate change linked to 5 million deaths a year, study reported in Bloomberg. So those things, when I say brought to you by American business, are the result of a business model that no rational, self-interested person would agree to from behind a veil of ignorance. These have been all very profitable, but the terms of the deal, as it were, the terms of a contract, are one that none of us would actually freely agree to. So the business model that I'm talking about is where profits come directly or indirectly about lies, certainly about the 2020 election, risks of COVID, the reality and risks of climate change, conflict, fear, ignorance, prejudice, and hatred. Now, when I talk about these as lies, I want to be really clear about the fact that there is no debate about what counts as facts in this situation. There's tons of information. The 2020 election was not stolen. The risks of COVID were severe. Risks and reality of climate change are serious. Now, one of the reasons that I'm confident in saying this is that my profession is as a researcher. That's my job. Now, I've been doing it for decades. I'm good at it. I know when there's a question how to find good information, and yeah, there are maybe dimensions of all of this that there is some room for debate. There is no room for debate about the fact that the election was not stolen, that COVID was potentially, not potentially, was in fact, dramatically harmful, and that climate change was, real and human, human driven. Now, it doesn't take a lot of imagination to then say, if we then sort of expand, okay, it isn't just a matter of lies we're talking about, but conflict, fear, ignorance, prejudice, and hatred. And you think about what we see on different social media sites. And this is, as I said, where we get the lack of regulation, we get the lack of gatekeepers when we move to cable and we move to the web. That how this can spread. And so we're now shift to, the information industry. Facebook, 3 billion people use it. Twitter, now X, 415 million, and at least 71% of get some of Americans get some news from social media. So, for example, here, 20% of the population, U.S. adults, often get news from social media. Another 30% get it sometimes. So that's 50% right there. Rarely, 19%, never 31%. I happen, by the way, to be in the never, because even if I see something on social media, I have to, I'll track it back to a source to find out whether it's true or not. In my business, I know how to identify better versus worse sources of information. And if I see something on social media that is, claiming to be, a fact, I check it out because I know the business model of social media companies is not to report truth. The business model of social media companies is engagement. The business model is based on advertising rates. And that means you whatever you do, you say whatever you can say in order to get people to watch and to click. So I know that you shouldn't be getting news from social media sites because not what they're built for. On the heels of the January 6th congressional probe, the House committee showed that there was really significant ways in which the social media in the 2020 election, social media companies did not address the online extremism and calls for violence that led to the Capitol riot. Just this sprinkling of headlines, QAnon, after 2020 now comes back, on Twitter, and that's an absolutely bizarre controversy. One of the most disgusting thing, Elon Musk's sort of reframes the thing about how Nancy I'm sorry attack on Fauci. The guy is just a physician. The guy is just a scientist trying to do his job in terms of public health. Anti-Semitism, Jews and gays, attacks on Jews and gays. Twitter, it just becomes a welcoming environment. Election deniers, Elon Musk, the kind of attack he went on when Nancy Pelosi's husband got attacked. He's back to spreading election information, but there are no fact checkers. They've been tossed out. Twitter ends its ban on COVID misinformation. Twitter's panel on hate speech is disbanded. Facebook bans hate speech, but still makes money from white supremacists. It's just got kind of on and on and on. And Trump came back on X. And most recently, and this is one of the last thing, this is something that you have to keep in mind. This was true in 2016. Russia tried it again in 2020, got less traction, but they're doing it again. Russia is undermining election integrity in democracies, and that's worldwide. One of the benefits of the technology is not only the upside, but it does make it possible relatively inexpensively to spread propaganda and misinformation and try to destabilize. And anyone who does not know that Vladimir Putin and other authoritarians are actively spending money trying to destabilize every democracy on the planet. You just don't, I don't know what world you're living in. That's a fairly easy thing to verify. And now it's logical. If you've got the money and you've got the capacity and you're an authoritarian, you're going to try to, excuse me, you're going to try to destabilize, opposing political systems who are trying to protect basic human rights. So this is also something to keep in mind that it was well documented that in 2016, Russia used U.S. social media to sow dissent and to spread lies of all sorts. Now, it would be a nice thing if one thing we all agreed on, at least, is that American elections are decided by Americans who are registered to vote, and that they make the decision and they get good information and they make their own decision. Not that it's determined by the meddling of a foreign nation. So let's talk a little bit about Fox News, because Fox really is the poster child for this kind of business model. It's okay. Fox News is the direct descendant of News of the World, which was a newspaper in a tabloid in London. It sort of trafficked in gossip, in controversy, but it got put out of business. It's a huge scandal. I'll tell you a little bit about that in a minute, but it was so bad that the News of the World closed down. Now, Rupert Murdoch, who owned it, said it's the biggest inquiry ever over next to nothing. And that what people were complaining about was just part of the culture of Fleet Street, the British tabloid press. However, there was a parliamentary investigation. And here's just kind of a snippet on what happened. So in July of 2011, Murdoch and the News Corporation came under intense scrutiny for wrongdoing at News of the World. Mounting evidence indicated that newspaper staffers had engaged in illegal and unethical behavior, notably the hacking of mobile phone mailboxes belonging to celebrities, murder victims, and British soldiers killed in the Afghanistan war. Murdoch shuttered the newspaper later in July, but the scandal continued to grow. He subsequently testified on several occasions before British MPs, claiming he had been unaware of the hacking. Murdoch's son James, considered his heir apparent, was also embroiled in the controversy and later left several key posts. In May 2012, a parliamentary panel tasked with investigating the scandal released a highly critical report which stated that Rupert is not a fit person to exercise the stewardship of a major international company, and that he showed willful blindness concerning misconduct within his corporation. Now, I want to just tell you about one story here, which was the one that really caught the public's attention. The hacking of mobile phone mailboxes belonging to, in this case, a murder victim. There was a 13-year-old girl who disappeared, and obviously her parents fearing that she had been murdered. They weren't getting a kidnap, a ransom request. Part of what happened as the search went on was that the authorities discovered that her mailbox, the girl's mailbox, was accessed, and it made it then look like she was still alive. So, parents get new hope. The investigation goes in that direction. It turned out that she was in fact dead at that point, but the mailbox had been accessed by one of the staffers, people connected with News of the World. There was obviously a huge public outcry because they were doing this to get a story. But it really shows you the kind of lack of conscience that you would traffic in this kind of thing for the sake of a story and for the sake of profit. So News of the World closes down, but 1996, Fox News gets rolled out in the US, has about anywhere from 2-3 million daily viewers. About 43% of Americans get their news from that. And as you know, if you're a business student and you've been following this, Fox News got hammered in their lawsuit with Dominion, the voting company. Now, first of all, you should know that it is virtually impossible to win a defamation trial like this. I mean, this was one. Maybe there was one before, but of a small sort. But by and large, for decades, the legal precedent has been: look, it's got to be. The evidence has to be over the top. It has to be malice. It has to show that you absolutely knew that what you're reporting was false, and that's what got showed. Now, Dominion settled. I mean, they accepted a settlement from Fox News. They were asking for more than that. And this is only the first case. I mean, there are more that are coming down that Fox News is in the target for. But what was clear, if you followed this at all, was that Sean Hannity, other Fox people, they knew that what they were reporting was false. They knew it was false. They were doing it for ratings. They were doing it to keep their audience, as it were. They knew, and it was a clear case. It was so over the top that they knew that if they let it go to the jury, it was going to be a whole lot more money than even what they suggested. So this is, I'd like to believe that we'd all say that it's unacceptable for a business to make money on reporting lies, knowing that they are false, reporting it that it's true, and they're just doing that for money. Now, this is where some of the PIAC stuff comes in. Think about how many people simply believe that what the people on Fox were saying was true because they didn't know or didn't take the time to check out whether there was contravening evidence. And this then becomes one of the big things here about what are the limits that you're going to put on this kind of thing. Okay, so that's Fox and other companies that do the same sort of thing. What I want to point out is something that people rarely talk about is that there's the indirect benefit that comes to the cable TV and streaming providers, of which there are about more than 500 channels and the providers. Now, this is the way the industry is built. So you get, and if any of you have websites, you know this. So you've got platforms which then depend on cloud services, content delivery networks, domain registers, internet service providers. You're paying. If you're Fox News, if you're Facebook, if you're Twitter, if you're running anything on the internet, you've got to go through all these steps, and they're all making money off of this. Now, they are not directly making money in the way that we might say Fox and Twitter and X are, but they're making money, and they aren't doing anything. They aren't doing anything about it. They're passively allowing for all of this. I'm sure if one of these or some of these, wanted to decide they're going to be gatekeepers, there would be a huge, legal battle about this. But it does mean that there are gatekeepers that are just not doing anything about this. So my argument is that we have a new business model. Profits come directly or indirectly from lies, conflict, fear, ignorance, prejudice, and hatred. And that once you let the genie out of the bottle into the society, things get a whole lot worse. And so it may produce a huge amount of profit, but it does a lot of social harm. But what we have then is a system where, when I talk about the misinformation, the monetization of misinformation, conflict, and fear, is that we have an industry where the business model is drive conflict, drive fear, drive ignorance, drive people being upset because it's profitable. How did we get here? This is what we've been looking at so far, because we have a population that's vulnerable to that and can be easily manipulated. And one final thing I'll leave you with is the final question. If intelligence and comedy, getting along with one another, are so important, why do we consistently undermine them? Why are we so happy to make money from ignorance and conflict, despite the obvious self-destructive consequences? Now, you're all savvy enough to, that at this point I can say, the next time you read a news feed, the next time you, look, particularly your favorite one, ask yourself, is there a way in which information is being slanted? See, if you shift your view of what you're looking at as it's a source of information to it's a source of advertising rates, it then puts you into a certain frame of mind where no matter whether you're looking at Fox or Facebook or X or the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal, you get to say, particularly, if you're looking at something online, remember, newspapers now make their revenue off of online stuff. It's ad revenue. It's ad revenue. It's ad revenue. It's ad revenue rates. This is what you have to tell yourself. And I'm not talking about this as a political issue. I'm talking about this as a business model. And right now, the business model is certainly benefiting, conspiracy theorists and that crowd, because that's currently where you have a very fervent market. But if you read closely, for example, in so-called left-wing newspapers, you will see a sort of to some extent a modest version of this, but not. Look at how many stories, the headlines of which are supposed to engender in liberals the fear that Donald Trump may win the 2024 election. How many headlines, how many stories, particularly lead ones, are one that's supposed to make people uneasy about the protection of their rights one way or another? Ask yourself, when you look at things, are you getting simply a neutral reporting of facts? Are you getting opinion? Are you getting slant? Are you getting something when you sort of scan a site and you look at a headline and you say, oh, that seems interesting, and you click? Did you click because something about that headline made you feel anxious? Something about it made you feel that there's conflict out there, that you may be the target, of something. The to some extent, the left is as guilty of the right as saying you're in the crosshairs of your enemy. They will do anything to take, your world against you. Both sides are selling the idea that we are in a state of catastrophe. As I mentioned, my story about the farm and the lightning strike, yeah, that's not necessarily the world in which we live. Nobody was worrying about whether, that farm was owned by, a left-wing, right-wing, trans, gay, straight family or whatever. It was us. These people got hurt. Our job is to help them. Um, and for example, on this issue of facts versus opinion, you will, I'm sure, regularly hear that there are references to the 2020 election as having been close. It wasn't. Now you've got to do look historically at this kind of thing, go back, and see what counted as close elections and not close elections. But there are ways. I'd suggest that, if you're trying to keep people anxious, you say, oh, 2024 could be as close as 2020. You keep people on edge. So what I'm suggesting, a lot of this is subtle. This is not as heavy-handed as it typically is on Fox. But I'm saying there is an industry around what should be information that capitalizes on the fact that the more apprehensive we get, the more concerned we get, the more we hear stuff that we worry about is true, the more we're being played. At least we're being played enough to click a story and to read. And broadly speaking, when we go back to the PIAAC, when we go back to other sorts of things that we've been looking at earlier, the reason that I'd say this is the most dangerous business ethics issue currently, the people aren't talking about, aren't appreciating the threat enough, is that so many people in our society are vulnerable to being taken advantage of, vulnerable to being manipulated, lied to because of what they do not know. And I'd say if we go back to talking about what John Rawls talks about and what we'd say are the terms of an agreement for what is a fair way to conduct business, I believe all of us would say you can't make a profit off of deceiving people. And especially as we saw with the Dominion Fox case, you can't make a decision. I mean, you shouldn't, from an ethical standpoint. You just shouldn't be doing this because you're just taking advantage of people. You're using them as means to an end. You're just using them, for your own purposes. And that's not okay for the way you want to do business. And especially, this is the last thing I want to say. I said in the course of the talk that freedom of expression is the way that a lot of this stuff is covered. It's people's opinion. People should be free to express their opinion. The voters should decide what's true, what's false. Freedom is a terrific thing. My claim is that the primary casualty in this business model is the freedom of the people who are being manipulated. They don't see it. They're the ones who are championing all of this, but it's their freedom which is being compromised. So think about all this. There are ways, and obviously we could go on for like this for a long time. I do have a bad habit of talking forever, which is what all teachers do. But that's the heart of my claim about the monetization of ignorance, fear, and conflict. And we'll be looking at this later in the course with some examples. But this is, at least I wanted to set things up as a broad theme that we'll come back to. And thanks very much.